On today's episode, we're joined by author, attorney, and historian Dennis A. Brennan, whose bold new book explores the striking parallels between Aaron Burr and Donald Trump. He challenges us to rethink political narratives and examine how history repeats itself. Get ready for a fascinating conversation. The following program is part of the Patriot Broadcasting Project, brought to you by the Scene Projects Podcast Network. Well, welcome into this exciting episode of the Patriot Broadcasting Project. With us today is Dennis A. Brennan. Dennis, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me, Bubba. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I was a little unprepared. I thought we were going to do an episode of our other show, The Scene Projects, which is more focused on music and culture. But after being told that I had the wrong Dennis Brennan, that we made a quick changeover. So I appreciate you being a little bit pliable for us today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your new book and getting to know you here. So before we get too far into everything, obviously, we're going to talk about that book and helping you to promote that. But we'd like to know a little bit of your backstory and how we got to here. So the floor is yours, sir.
Sure. Well, I've been an attorney for 35 years. And as part of that, I've been involved in local politics, state politics, helping on campaigns, even running some of them. So I have an interest in politics just in general. On top of that, before I went to law school and then somewhat after, I was also a newspaper reporter, edited a small community newspaper, even published a paper down the road. So I have some interest in how the media acts and how you're supposed to act. I combine both of those into this book dealing with both Donald Trump and Aaron Burr because of the similarities of, both how the press acted towards both of them, how history has acted towards both of them, and just the general politics where they came from and, where they went, so to speak. That's my background. I'm still practicing as an attorney. This is my first book. Hopefully there'll be more, but this is the first go around.
Fantastic. And love that you kind of have a media background in there as well, and kind of riding that line between the lawmakers and the people who kind of publicize how it is, because we know in this day and age, it's so easy to twist the story and to twist even quotes these days. Everything is taken out of context, and you have to be so careful about who you get your news from and deciphering what it is they're actually trying to tell you. So I'm thrilled to kind of hear your take on all of it, right? Like what is the media's role in the public portrayal of happenings throughout, whether it's politics or it's just the local news and local politics, and all the way up to the national scale. What do you think the media's role in this is? Is it to be a commentator, or should it be just to deliver the news as it is?
Yes, it should be just to deliver the news. In college, I studied journalism. So that was my background. Thought I would actually do that. I am glad I really didn't do that. But journalism, the way I was taught, and this goes back to the early '80s, you had the 5 W's and the 1 H. So in every story, especially in the introduction, you're supposed to have that in there, or at least emphasize that. And that's who, what, where, when, why are the 5 W's, and then the 1 H is how. That's the story you're supposed to build when you're writing a straight news story. You use those words to build it out. Somewhere along the line, journalism changed to advocacy, what they call advocacy journalism. And you can see it. I first saw it at the local level, working on political campaigns, where no matter what you did, there were certain reporters and columnists who would write things that just were a little bit slanted. They were trying to push their guy over the finish line. And that's at the local level. And I thought, well, it's local, they're idiots, whatever. They don't know what they're doing. But I never realized it had gone, national until really, Trump really made it clear. When Trump came into the spotlight, they were so, so far to the one side against him. No matter how you report it, it became, what's the worst thing we can see out of this to report? And they were really advocating for the other position rather than whatever he would say. Everybody that read about Trump, especially in the first term, you'd see fact checks or just, it's been debunked. That became a new word. Trump said whatever, that's been debunked. And I was like, where was it debunked? I didn't read it being debunked. So I'm no big fan of the media. In the book, I talk about the connections between, politicians, their staffs. Many of them have left and then go on to become, network stars. George Stephanopoulos is a good example. No journalism background whatsoever. And he's got one of the premier shows on a network. You would think you'd find someone who had a background in journalism to do that show. And you'd hope that that person's background would be free of bias, like you didn't work in the White House, for instance. And it's not only him. I listed a lot of people that are involved like that. Chuck Todd didn't even go to school for journalism, and he had a great premier show on NBC, but he worked for a staffer, worked on some political campaigns. When you do that, and it's only natural, I would do it too, you end up slanting the news for your party, your people. It's become that it's too hard to separate, and they really believe they're part of the campaign now, that they're fighting a good fight.
Right. They aren't journalists. They are media personalities, right? They are actors. They are portrayers who are reading from a script. And I've spent enough time in local news stations to see the teleprompters and to know how the game works. And that these people are not necessarily investigative journalism is all but dead, I would say, in this day and age, unless you're independent. Right. None of these major markets, they're, these major media players, the New York Times or the Washington Post or any of these, major conglomerates, they have no interest any longer in investigative journalism. They have a financial obligation to their advertisers and to their business to just print stuff that's going to get people to read it. And it's funny how we used to kind of laugh at tabloids, right? In the 90s, the tabloids and the salacious headlines, and they were a joke. And now that's kind of become all that journalism is, right? And not to the real journalist, but on the forward-facing front of it, is it's all just a joke. It's all salacious headlines. It's all clickbait. And there isn't really a whole lot of real news or journalism happening anymore. At least that would be the appearance to a small town guy like me.
Yeah, I think you're right on. That's a big part of the problem. And I think the excuse that they've used over the years is, well, you have to be first. They wanted to be first rather than right. And you would come out with a story. And now it's kind of gone even further where it's your team and my team. And, you'll see certain places where all their sources are coming from one party or the other, and they just buy into it. They don't ask for any proof. They don't check it out. There's an old saying with journalism, and it's been used a lot. If your mother tells you she loves you, get a second opinion, check it out. That's the rough translation of it. There's more to it, but that's what they should be doing, though. You can't just take, someone's word for it, and you can't say, okay, we'll print that because we want to see you do well. We've seen so many examples of it. The Russian collusion, which now I would say is the Russian hoax, has, brought that out with Trump for sure, where you had not only first being reported, I believe it's the New York Times or Washington Post, one of them won a Pulitzer for it. It's a fake story. And that's not the first time that the Pulitzer Award has gone on a fake story. There was one years ago about some kid that was a heroin addict at like 11 years old. They did a whole piece on it. It was all fake. There was no heroin addict. But that kind of diverts a little bit from this conversation. So it's a long history of, you know, rewarding bad journalism where nobody questions it. And
Well,
what you have,
and it
go ahead.
degrades the prize, right? I mean, a Pulitzer, if we know that you can just make up a fake story and win this what used to be a very prestigious award, right?
Mhm.
That we have degraded all of these things that we once held in a much higher regard. And it's very unfortunate because a lot of, journalists work their whole lives trying to attain that. And now it's been not just diluted, but completely denigrated to the point where it would almost be a detriment to a real journalist career to be awarded something that has been tainted in this way.
Sure, and I think the problem is when you see, um, the public's response to journalism, and the numbers are they're disliked or trusted about as much as Congress is. It's really a bad number, and that shouldn't be the case. You should look at it. Journalism. We should be able to trust what they're telling us. It shouldn't become what we made fun of. When I was studying it, which was really, oh, what's Pravda putting out in the Soviet Union? It was all slanted towards them. There's no real story there. It's whatever the government has told you. They've done that so many times now that people, I know I do it. I read a story and at first I'll check like, well, who's saying this? And then I'll say, that doesn't sound right. And you start to look and see, is anyone else reporting it? But that's not enough because the New York Times reports it and it sounds outlandish, but they report it and they'll say they have a source. Then the Washington Post reports that the New York Times is reporting and they'll just use that line. It's like, wait a minute, you can't just copy them and say they're reporting it. Nobody checked it out. So you end up with this constant, everybody doing the same story. They're all referring to a source nobody talked to. And a lot of times it's an anonymous source, so it could be just made up. And, or at least manufactured. What we saw with the Russian collusion, it was manufactured, if not made up, where they just created this, file, the dossier, and then all reported on it. Well, that's not the way journalism is supposed to work. And unfortunately, that's why you get these low numbers where nobody trusts the story. And people like me and maybe others will sit there and say, well, that doesn't sound right. Let me do my own research. So I'm researching like I'm the journalist. I've got to find the truth somewhere in there. Well, we don't have time to do that on every single story. We all have our own lives, families, work, whatever, to be doing the work that they were supposed to be doing in the first place.
And it's just completely devalued those publications, that loss of trust. And I think they're seeing it now. I think you're seeing a much different tone, especially out of the New York Times over the last year. And, for them, it seemed like as long as the advertising money was coming in, mostly from big pharma, I would assume. And, so, so you have this whole machine that is running on one side of the political aisle that is only pushing those ideas, and it happened to be some of the largest publications in the world. It put us into really a false world for the better part of a decade, really. I mean, you can I know we're going to point to, Trump coming down the escalator as kind of that point, because prior to that, he was a media darling. They loved him. And I love seeing the clips of him on The View and him with these ladies. And now you listen to how these people talk about him when the man never changed. He didn't change. They did. And it's so blatant to see that. And I'm glad that we brought this over to this network because we talk about it a lot. We mostly focus on our local and state politics. We've had a couple of our South Dakota state representatives on. We've had our U.S. congressional candidate, James Bialotta, on with us to talk about these things that we face at the local level, because in South Dakota, there's really two major news networks across the entire state, and the newspapers are all owned by the same company and the radio stations are all owned by the same. It's very easy for them to create this feedback loop. And with the lack of a lot of independent media, there's maybe our programming and a newspaper called the Dakota Scout that it's spun off from one of the major newspapers because they were tired of not getting to report the truth, right? They were tired of being told, no, this is the company line that you're going to toe, and that's it. And it's just it needs to be, first of all, exposed, which I think, books like you've written now, and some of these equating it to history. This isn't the first time we've seen something like this. So I'd love to take this opportunity to kind of get into really what your book is about, and telling people that this isn't the first time that these major publications in the United States, they may have different names now, of course, but this play is as old as our country.
It is, and that's interesting. When I started researching on the book and realized some of the things I didn't know, and even though I studied journalism, I don't know if that's an indictment on my own ability to educate myself or my school, or just in general, maybe it's not something that was really taught in great detail. But back in the days of Aaron Burr, there was something called the party press era, where the political parties or the members of the party, the top guys, owned the newspapers. And obviously, you had Democrat papers, Republican papers, and you didn't have the other media at that time. You just had newspapers. But yes, they were very slanted, and they would do the same thing they're doing now. So we've had a return to that time with how many people will tell you they hate CNN or they hate Fox, and you can almost immediately say, well, I know which way they vote, or they'll just have different understandings of an event that happened. And it was the same way then. So, Burr had to deal with that. One of the guys who was his, I'd say, enemy is Alexander Hamilton. They had the duel. Hamilton started the New York Post, happens to still be around. But there were many papers. Hamilton had allies. One of the guys that prosecuted Burr, Davies, had a paper out in Missouri. So these papers were spread everywhere, and they were all funded by the political parties, which is kind of fascinating because while we moved to more supposed capitalist ownership and trying to make money, we still have that party, influence on our media outlets. I mean, Fox News really started, I think, because the other networks were slanted too far to the left. And Roger Ailes saw an avenue where you could get a lot of conservatives, and they do get a lot to watch their shows. And I think, when you look at it that way, that's really not how journalism is supposed to be. But we see it again now with a lot of podcasts that have popped up over the last 5-10 years. We've seen, X. Well, it used to be Twitter. As Elon said, we are the news. In some ways, that's true. A lot of people get their news now on social media, and a lot of it is being broken on there. Now, you're also running into the problem of, on your feed, you might see somebody who's just spreading total lies, but that's not any different than what you do if you pick up one of the major newspapers and you read it. I get the Chicago Tribune delivered to my house, and I'll start reading the story, and I'm like, where did they come up with this? It's the opinion of the writer is in there. And this is supposed to be a hard news story. And you might not get to the real facts until page, 6, where you turn it over. And that's a problem if you're a reader. But it's not something totally new. They had the party press era. They got to the point where it was a little better. Journalism, I think, had improved. Maybe the best time for journalists was, around Watergate, where you actually had them breaking news stories. And when you look at, a show that's still on, 60 Minutes, those that are old enough to remember it when it started would say that was a hard-hitting news show. They had a lot of news stories and investigations and so forth. Now it's hard to watch it. It's very biased.
And it's all hard to watch. I think no matter which side of the political aisle, I don't have cable. I don't get any of my news from there. I would rather watch a podcast like Tim Pool where at least I'm being read the story. This is the source. This is what we're doing. And then we're telling you that we're giving our opinions about it. And then he always makes sure to have a differing of opinion on there on a panel of 5 people. I would say that the show is kind of modeled almost around what Bill Maher's show used to be, right? They're a little more conservative leaning in their views. I would say, Tim Pool is probably more of a libertarian than anything, but you go and look at what they say about him on left media and he's a far right extremist, right? And you're like, no, I listen to the man every day and he has a lot of what you would term left-wing views on social issues and some things like that. But you've swung the pendulum, and there's only so many times you can call someone a racist and a bigot. And I think that play is kind of worn out. It's not working anymore. The cancel culture isn't working anymore. And now, unfortunately, it seems like the left, the far left extremists are just going to turn to violence. And we've seen an increase in that over the last the last month has been unreal, with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, with attacks on ICE facilities around the country, and to the point where now we have National Guard that are being sent out in these cities to defend people that are trying to do their job to get these tens of millions of illegal aliens that were let in under a previous administration out of our country. I think that it all has to start from there. And the way that it's all being spun in the media and how it is emboldening regular, citizens to go out and to commit acts as atrocious as murder is just beyond me. And it is all fueled and driven by a media and by news publications that aren't reporting on the news whatsoever.
No, I agree. And I do think, it's terrible. Obviously, the Charlie Kirk assassination really hit home for a lot of viewers, a lot of people out there, because, we see it on video for one thing. He's famous for doing these college campus tours, and everything you're doing is being videoed by your own people, but also other people have their phones up thinking they're going to get him to say something, good or bad. And it's terrible when you see it. And then you start realizing why this man, and I'm not going to call him a kid, because to me, that's the cop out when someone's, over 20, actually over 18, but when you're 22, you should know better. Sorry. You don't go around shooting people, because you're upset with what they said. It really is an attack on freedom of speech in its worst form. It's bad enough that you see other attempts, Donald Trump twice, the idea that they're going after some of the Supreme Court justices. And it's just, it's the worst type of assassination attempts. You're trying to stifle the opposition instead of, not that there's a great assassination attempt, and all these people have some mental illness problem one way or the other, but to try to shut down free speech, it doesn't work anyhow. I mean, I don't understand how they think taking a gun and shooting Charlie Kirk is going to stop people from talking about the issues that were important to him. Well,
it's terrorism. It is an act of terrorism, because you are trying to silence the masses by making it very evident that we will kill anyone who is going to speak up and what was such a shame about Charlie. And I hope that his death, his murder on national television and the reverberations of that are that more people want to have real conversations, because that's all he was doing. And for people that get out and to call him all of the racist and the bigot and all of these things that I've heard, is like, you've never watched any of his clips from these college campuses. You've never actually listened to the man at all. You're just parroting some narrative, or you saw a clip taken out of context and you saw that one thing. The man put on tens of thousands of hours of content, of which I have not consumed even a small fraction of it, but enough to know that he was not who the left media was trying to say. And the fact that people went out, not just celebrated his death, but then rail against their own rights to free speech with the Jimmy Kimmel fallout. Nobody stopped Jimmy Kimmel from going out and saying what he did, but there are repercussions to those actions as well. Your free speech is not being limited. You had the freedom to go say what you wanted to say. You said it. Now you have repercussions of those actions. That is much different than someone telling you that you cannot say something or that you're not allowed to do that. And I think there's a huge disparity between, what is free speech and what they're terming as First Amendment right violations.
Right. And I think, obviously when you kill Charlie Kirk, you're shutting down his First Amendment rights to speak. And, the rest of us, I have seen quite a few of his videos. And the reason, I have a Samsung TV and there's a network on which his podcast plays. So recently, probably 3 weeks before he was killed, I had seen a lot of those. Also with X, a lot of them play. And, it is exactly what you said. People will take either snippets or more likely they repeat what they've heard because they're too lazy to look it up. I spoke before about having to look up when you see something, gee, is that right? Let me look it up. Because Kirk has been called a homophobe, a racist, transphobe. I looked and saw on each of those issues what he actually said. And they were not, indicative of how these people are calling him a racist or a homophobe. He actually defended, there was a guy in one of those college campus meetings where a guy stood up and was railing about gay people being within the conservative movement. And Kirk really just shot him down and said things like, do you want to keep Guy Benson out of the conservative movement because he's gay? Do you want? And this guy in the audience says, yes. And Kirk said, then you're not a conservative. You're not a Republican. That's not the party. And he said, get out of here. He just pointed towards the door as if he was Ralph Cramden or something. But it was a good video. It showed in his heart, he's not a homophobe. Now, he did explain he's a Christian. He doesn't believe you should do that, but he doesn't think that those people shouldn't be allowed to be part of a political party or express their views. And I think the guy asking the question might have been the homophobe, but he certainly wasn't. And same thing with those other issues. He wasn't a racist. And if you look at it, it's unfortunate that people are able to spread those kind of lies. I guess they did it when he was alive and they're doing it when he died also. But it's up to everybody else to set the record straight. And I think part of that is why I wrote this book, to set the record straight. It's often that, you see newspapers, and I do have a quote in the book about how newspapers are the first recording of history. It's a quote that Philip Graham, who used to be the publisher of the Washington Post, said. And it's true. But then after that, history has to be written. And if you sit there and allow the other side, I'm doing it now too, if you allow other people to decide what's true, you end up with a large group of future populations thinking that Donald Trump was controlled by, the Russians, that he was a Russian asset. There are people that still think that, even though all the evidence shows that's not the case. Beyond the 4 years, as president, where you saw nothing like that, we now have evidence that it was all a hoax. That it was all made up by the Clinton campaign and the Obama administration. And it's sad, though, that the news media on all sides should be broadcasting that everywhere. And they've kind of covered it up in some cases.
Well, and I've heard people talk about it that, there's a reason that they do this, and it's not for the people that are here now. It's so that 10, 20 years down the line, they can point back at all of these articles and all of these archives that they've created of that, and to go, oh no, look, he was this person, when everybody who knows better is dead and gone. And you're using it to brainwash a future generation. And it's why books like yours and more archives that tell the truth are so important. In many ways, podcasts have become an archive. And I think a lot of people who maybe believed what the left said, that had the willingness to challenge that idea and to go and to actually watch Charlie, in Charlie's own words, realized and for the first time maybe had their eyes opened up to what the propaganda machine on the left side of the media is, because everything that Charlie said is on tape. It's out there. You can't take snippets of everything. And if you're willing to go explore, then you're going to discover the truth. And I think that's why podcasts are so important. And I know now, I think even more so how important they are, because they are our own archive of the truth as it was, and without the spin and without the inclinations of a few advertisers or, whatever it may be that drives that business and keeps these publications afloat.
Well, that's exactly true. And I think, we touch upon that in the book on how the media has changed. And I think that's the pushback that we're seeing now with the podcasts and other things. With the book, you look at it, Aaron Burr is a good example of how history has done him wrong, basically. And there's a few people. I mean, I started this book researching it because a friend of mine wrote a book just about Aaron Burr. And this friend happens to be a Democrat Party consultant. He's run congressional races. Bright guy. We disagree on some political issues, but he asked me to read it. I did. And a few weeks later, he came back to the office and said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, I think I didn't know all this about Aaron Burr, but more importantly, I think you missed the story. How they treated Burr is how they've treated Trump." Now, he didn't buy into that. He looked at me like I had two heads or something. It is that divide between Democrat and Republican. And, I said, well, if you're not going to correct it, then I'm going to correct it, because someone has to tell the real story. I do believe Aaron Burr is known more, besides that he shot and killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel that Hamilton challenged him to. There's the Burr conspiracy, which, if anybody knows, we break it down in the book on how it really had no legs. It was, charges against him on treason that he actually won in court twice. But for a long time, a lot of people think Aaron Burr was a traitor. He wasn't. He served in the military. He was a vice president. He was a patriot. But the story they tell makes him out to be the bad guy. And, it has to be told differently. And the same thing for Donald Trump. If we go on 60 years or 100 years, people look and go, well, Donald Trump was the guy that was controlled by the Russians, and they fixed the election, and all these things that we think have been debunked, at least in real time, will carry on for future generations. So that's part of why we need, stuff recorded. We need stuff in books where the real story's told, because that is history.
Incredible stuff, Dennis. Where can people find the book now? I'll have you plug the name and everything for us. Yeah. And I want to thank you for your time today. It's been a great conversation.
Well, thank you. The book is called DC's Swamp Strikes Back, Aaron Burr, Donald Trump, and Their Similar Battles. This is how it looks. And it is available on my website, which is authordennisbrennan.com. It's also available in 50 other locations. I don't know all of them, but I do know Barnes & Noble is one and Amazon is another one. You can get it in hard cover, paperback. There's an e-version or Kindle. So there's many ways to get it. But the easy way is authordennisbrennan.com, and it's on sale now.
Fantastic. Well, Dennis, I appreciate you taking the time to write the book. And I appreciate you taking a little time for us today to come on the show as well, sir. Thank you for being part of the scene.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.